In addition to the monuments and things, my favorite reason for being in Washington is it's the only place in the world that I can travel to, and I'm not the dorkiest or wonkiest person in the room, and it's quite a relief. That said, this presentation is exceedingly tedious. So for those of you. Who are in this sort of swath where you can't really see the screen, there are really lots of seats up here, and it's so tedious that I even find so I will not be offended if you get up in the middle of it and need to leave to go off to some other thing or just because you can't take any more of it. So really, please move on up. It will be more interesting for me as we go into this. So do we have of course we have PowerPoint because we can't do planning without PowerPoint. And I've got an enormous number of slides, and I am going to speak very quickly because what I really want is to make sure that we have time for question and answer at the end of this. Here we are. What I'm going to... Yep. And now, does anyone have any questions? So what I'm going to talk about is some of the cognitive dissonance of my industry. So what we do a lot of is try to make clear a lot of the nonsense that my industry works really hard at obfuscating so that none of you people understand what it is that we're doing so we can keep going and doing the thing that we really want to do, which is to build roads. But instead, some of you may be interested and thinking about transportation not as an end in itself, but as a means for achieving larger goals, including, like the usual triple bottom line of economy and ecology and equity, but also, public health, also fun, also flirtiness, because I would argue that all cities live and die based upon the quality of the flirtation, but that is another lecture. So what I'm going to be focusing on, because I didn't have enough time to go through the full 12 steps of getting off of your traffic engineering addiction, we're instead going to cover 7 steps that are applicable at really all levels of community, including the whole array of communities in this region. Okay, now these are the slides that don't work, but we're going to go through this. Oh wait, actually back up. There needs to be a little preamble. There we go. All right. So one of the things that I love about the public health industry is they have fantastic data, and not only do they collect really, really good data, but unlike my industry, they actually go back and do after data. Like they'll do their projections, but then they'll actually test using facts to see whether their projections came true. And so one of the things that the Centers for Disease Control has done over the last 30 years or so is tracked obesity rates in the United States. And now you can march through these. So that's 86, 87, 88, 89, 91, 92, and so on. And you can see as the scale changes, and obesity spreads across the United States to the point where now huge chunks of the United States, particularly in the Mississippi Basin, back when, more than 30% of adults are clinically obese. This is not only an incredibly big social problem and public health problem, but it's also a transportation problem. And in fact, much of this, next slide, is caused by the way in which we invest in transportation, the way in which we make transportation decisions. In fact, if you look at the top 10 leading causes of death in the United States, half of those are transportation related, either directly in the form of motor vehicle crashes, one of the most dangerous things that any of us will ever do is to drive a car, or it is a result of secondary impacts like inhalation of pollution and cancers related to that and asthma related to that, or more importantly, factors that are related to sedentary lifestyles, something that we saw in the previous slides. And in fact, one of the most interesting themes of research in the public health industry is the clinical condition of road rage. And Tom Vanderbilt writes about this very eloquently in his book, Traffic, that describes in detail how the human brain, which evolved to accommodate us as tribal social primates on the savanna, is incredibly skilled at allowing us to take in an enormous amount of complex social information when we're a part of a social network. And all of those skills that we have in dealing with groups of people in a crowded marketplace are subverted when we're trapped in the metal carapace of a car. And so the subtle social signals that we're able to send to somebody when we accidentally bump into somebody, it's not possible for us to do that in a car. And so our brains freak out, literally. And in fact, the amygdala, the reptilian portion of our brain, fires tremendously as a result of the frustration that we experience in not having the kind of communication, social communication that our brain was programmed for, that it triggers our flight or fight instinct. And when this happens repeatedly in traffic congestion, both the amygdala and the hippocampus release a swarm of chemicals in our brain that actually causes permanent damage to the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that is about decision-making, being able to invest in the future, to not just simply react. It's the part of the brain that controls our immediate reactions. And so, in fact, being trapped in your car can not only drive you crazy, but it can make you permanently angry. And we see not only are people getting angry and road rage increasing in the country, but one of the results is increase in pedestrian fatality rates on our streets as people are behaving in less and less social ways. And those pedestrian fatality rates get even worse if you are brown or older. And they're even worse still as our society ages. I think many of you have seen the silver tsunami charts, the black bars being the pattern of our aging society, where in 2030, an enormous percentage of people in our country are going to be older adults who have very different mobility needs that are not being designed for. And of course, there's a strong relationship between how we design for transportation and global warming, with between 30 and 50% of CO2 emissions in most states coming from the transportation sector, and about 30 to 50% of those transportation, or actually 50 to 75% of those CO2 emissions in the transportation sector being from us driving our personal cars. So there are all of these problems that every sector of our society is dealing with, and dealing with at great expense. And people are very confused why this is happening. Why are these changes happening, and happening so rapidly in our society? And so what is the root of the problem? The root of the problem is the way we are designing land use and the resulting transportation decisions that need to be made in order to accommodate this. And the result, of course, with land use decisions that make it illegal to be able to walk to get a quart of milk, is that more people are driving, and the poor people who are forced to walk are enduring horrendous conditions. And so the most sprawled locations across the country also have by far the highest pedestrian fatality rates, data that Reed Ewing and others have collected. And the more sprawled you are, the higher your obesity rates are and the higher your public health costs are. So why are we here? These are obvious problems. We're all seeing the results of the problems. And when we look at all of the public policy statements that are out there, any sort of general plan or city plan or downtown plan or policy statement that every city council has adopted anywhere in the country say, oh, mixed use, compact development near transit, alternative modes are good, promote walking and biking, honor motherhood, enjoy apple pie. These are what everything says. And so you go out there and you look at what these policy statements are building, and they're this, right? Who knows where the heck this is? I don't even know. It could be anywhere. You'd have to look at the tree species to sort of figure out where you are in the country. And this is mixed use development. So there's some residential over there on the right, and we've got some, commercial, and here's, I don't know, maybe a hotel or something, and some office, and, stores, and, there are sidewalks. Look at the sidewalks. There's very nice landscaping, and, it's pedestrian oriented, because look, there's a pedestrian even in this view. And this is what the policy statement that is not connected to the DNA of the design manuals, the transportation performance metrics, the funding formulas, everything that actually determines how we're spending our transportation dollars, is completely disconnected from those flowery policy statements that the politicians have imposed. And so the result is that we're sending somewhat of a mixed message to our communities that say, do all this wonderful pedestrian-oriented stuff, but then don't design for it. So what do we do? So there are a lot of solutions. I mean, every city in the country is struggling with this whole set of problems, and they're finding, as they get deeper into the weeds, that in fact the solutions are really not that hard if we take the time to understand the role of transportation in creating place, the role of transportation in creating economic development, the role of transportation in creating health, social equity, and other outcomes. But it takes a little bit of weeding through the intentional obfuscation of my industry for normal human beings to understand what it is that we do. So some things that everyone needs to understand is that land use determines travel behavior overwhelmingly, and one of the biggest factors is density. As density increases, the opportunity for mode choice happens, and if you combine density with walkability and with other modal choices, generally life gets better. And another critical point is that you don't have to be of Manhattan density, which is over at this end of the chart. All you need to be is sort of streetcar suburb, like, small lot single family homes, townhouses, 2- and 3-story development makes a huge difference in travel behavior. You don't need 20-story buildings. Other things that we find is that nothing makes walking or biking safer better than more walking and biking. Making walking and biking a pleasure, making it delightful, seductive to walk and bike, to bring more people out, to pay attention to women and children, to make it a pleasure for women and children to walk at all times of day on any street. Do that and everything else is easy. Other things that we found, and though few people are doing this research anymore, is Donald Appleyard's fantastic work way back from the 1970s in his book Livable Streets was actually able to quantify the social capital impact of different ways of designing and managing streets. This is work that all of you should be familiar with. Have people read Appleyard? So a few of you. Livable Streets, Donald Appleyard, the results that he came up with back in 1972 are still valid today and are becoming, the quantitative methods that he used are becoming more relevant. Other things that we're finding are getting even more interesting, getting back to this relationship between transportation and brain chemistry and the role that our primordial kind of social primate brains play in us. We find in some of the more recent research, just coming out of the last couple of years, that even short periods of outdoor exercise, walking or biking outdoors, and oddly, the difference is remarkable between walking and biking on a treadmill inside versus walking outside, releases a remarkable chemical in the brain called oxytocin and is responsible for self-esteem, for mood. It's particularly effective for people who are shy or have mental disorders. But more importantly, this is the biological basis of trust. Oxytocin is the chemical in the brain that allows us to create mutually reciprocal trust relationships. And it very strongly increases positive social behavior, thinking about others in our actions, using empathy as part of our decision making. Oxytocin, in fact, is so powerful that it is actually sold commercially as a sex hormone, right? So the way, like in addition to walking and biking, oxytocin is released in a couple of different ways. It is released through intimate eye contact, again, going back to our social nature. It's released when we're out enjoying ourselves outside, particularly with our friends, but it's most powerfully released in orgasm and in breastfeeding. And so there is this remarkable thing that we can do to enhance the happiness and social trust of entire communities by making walking an enjoyable and useful part of everyday life. And so the clinical research is very clear that driving too much makes us fat and sick. It makes us die early. It makes us poor because we're spending too much of our household income on maintaining our cars. It makes us dumb. It actually damages our ability to have higher functional reasoning. It makes us angry and it makes us mistrustful. At the same time, more walking and biking makes us fitter. smarter, able to handle more complex reasoning, sexier, more loving, and more trustful. So what is there not to like? So the question then is, why is our entire transportation system, why is the success of our entire transportation network judged based solely on the needs of this creature rather than this one or this one, neither of whom are included in any of our transportation performance metrics? So what can you all do at home? There are several things. And I would argue that the most important is the incredibly tedious and wonkish topic of transportation performance metrics to make sure that you are measuring what matters. So keeping in mind that transportation is not an end in itself, that mobility in and of itself, having people move around in circles, does not achieve any positive social good. That the job of transportation and transportation investments are to create larger social goods. And if those larger social goods are not measured and if they're not quantified in all of the transportation decision making, they are going to be ignored. And we're going to go back to prioritizing seconds of delay that motor vehicles experience at arbitrary intersections. And these performance metrics are buried in a dozen different locations, and you have to root them out in every single one of those locations. They're buried in decision making about how to allocate your transportation capital dollars. They're buried in transportation impact analyses that you do in an environmental report or in a traffic analysis. They're buried in the operational details of how you do your signal timing. So, for example, when you're focused on auto level of service, a person on board a full bus is valued at only 1/60th the value as a human being as somebody driving alone in an SUV. So because intersection level of service measures seconds of delay for the vehicle, not for the person, people who take a bus are less valuable citizens. People who walk or bike are ignored completely. So what do we do? Well, one of the first things to understand is that while mobility is important, mobility creates a lot of opportunity for economic expansion, for the market to kind of step in and do interesting things because people can get around. Mobility is an important set of measurements within transportation, but accessibility is also important, and it's something that's routinely ignored. Oftentimes, the best transportation plan is a good land use plan that locates the needs of daily life immediately accessible to jobs and workplaces. So you can eliminate the need for an investment in mobility by making an investment in accessibility. So either by moving stuff closer together or by substituting technology for the need to actually get around physically. It's also important to look very carefully and to understand how particularly pernicious intersection level of service is as a primary transportation performance indicator. So what intersection level of service does, most of you have probably heard of this, but it's a letter grade system, A through F, that at least it's measured, I mean, one of the things is it's measured in different ways depending upon what questions you asked of it, but typically it's measured in terms of seconds of delay that motor vehicles experience at an intersection. And about every 15 seconds of additional delay, you move to an additional letter grade. And if you get level service F, most people think that it's like your kid coming home with the F on her report card, and that clearly must be really, really bad and must stand for failure, when instead, basically what it refers to is a certain set of seconds of delay that you can expect. And from an economist perspective, level service F means that your resource is being fully utilized. So from an economist perspective, level of service F is great. From a retailer's perspective, level service fine is okay, but level service D is optimal because it means the traffic is still moving really well, but it's moving slow enough that people can see into my storefront. So how you interpret level of service depends upon your perspective. It's also important to include other perspectives like economic development. That's the primary reason we make transportation investments. Any politician or traffic engineer who tells you that they're making a transportation investment in order to alleviate congestion, we're lying to you. There are no transportation projects that have ever alleviated congestion. There are transportation projects that have created the potential for economic expansion by expanding capacity to allow more cars or buses or bikes or whatever to move in that space. We primarily make transportation investments for economic development reasons, but we don't measure that, and so we get our investments wrong. We especially don't measure the impact of transportation on quality of life, on social justice, on ecological sustainability. And again, if you're not capturing these values and quantifying them in your decision making, they're going to be ignored. There are lots of examples of cities and regions that have good systems of measurement that include the usual triple bottom line of economy, equity, and environment, and that set quantitative targets that they want the transportation system to achieve, and then figure out what are the transportation investments that are necessary in order to achieve those targets. So in the San Francisco Bay Area, the targets are about primarily CO2 and particulate reduction. They're focused on reducing congestion, but it's actually shorthand for meeting the mobility needs of the growing region based upon specific growth projections. They look at the housing plus transportation equation to make sure that low-income people are not spending too much of their income on housing. And then the transportation plan there actually projects trends for each of these metrics, goes out and measures what the status quo would achieve, and then figures out what's the necessary set of investments in order to achieve the target. Other cities like Santa Monica in Los Angeles, of all places, have eliminated intersection level of service and switched to person delay rather than vehicle delay, or more importantly, looked at overall corridor travel time. How long does it take to get from A to B? That's what people really care about. You don't really care how many seconds you're at a random intersection. What you care about is, can I get to school within 15 minutes? More importantly, other jurisdictions have included levels of service for all modes of transportation, so that cars, buses, bikes, pedestrians, trucks can all be put on a level playing field, and that different thresholds can be set for different types of streets. So on a neighborhood residential street, you don't want the cars to be moving very fast. You don't care really if traffic is slow. What you really care about is residential property values and safety and pedestrians. In a commercial street, what you really care about is retail sales per square feet and parking availability for customers. In an industrial street, what you care about is, can the trucks make the appropriate maneuvers and get to their loading docks? So once you have good performance metrics, the second step is to start building those in to all of your types of analysis. And the most important kind of analysis is, varies from community to community, but environmental analysis and traffic impact analysis, very important to change, because right now, most approaches to environmental analysis and traffic impact analysis make it much more difficult to do infill development near transit than it is to do sprawl out in the middle of nowhere. Because in the infill location, you've already got some traffic congestion, and so therefore you will have a significant negative environmental impact. If you build out in the middle of nowhere, there's no impact because it's out in the middle of nowhere and no one cares. Of course, we don't notice that, in fact, those car trips that are generated out in the middle of nowhere end up coming back into the core that we were trying to protect by preventing infill development. So one of the key issues is the calculations that we make for different types of development. So if you assume that a development project in the middle of the city next to transit is going to generate vehicle trips at the same rate as a project out in the middle of nowhere, well, first of all, that's bad science, because we know that infill locations are going to generate about half the vehicle trips as something out in the middle of nowhere. Plus, it's harming your opportunity to do infill development. More importantly, what happens when your development project says, oh my goodness, we've gone from level service D to level service F. This is a disaster, and it requires mitigation. Your choices to mitigate this problem are limited. You can take what was a narrow road and you can widen it. Always a good choice. You can take your compact mixed-use development and you can make it much smaller so that it generates fewer trips. You could add parking, oftentimes a good choice in a traffic analysis, but you're really better off just moving it someplace else so that you don't have a negative impact in this location. Of course, the unintended negative consequence of these mitigations, these so-called mitigations, is to actually create a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if you reduce the project's density, well, you may have reduced the number of vehicle trips, but you've increased the trip rate. So from a regional perspective, you've worsened your problem while trying to solve your local problem. If you widen your roads, you may make it easier for cars, but you've just now made it more difficult for bikes and pedestrians in transit. And so as a result of widening the road, you've created mode shift away from walking and biking in transit to more driving, both through induced demand as well as through making your environment more hostile to pedestrians. You can move it to a more isolated location. But then, of course, you've just greatly increased the vehicle trip rate and lengthened every single one of those vehicle trips. And while you've moved the project out of creating a local impact, you've now created a vastly greater regional impact. You could maybe do some transportation demand management, but how do we know that you're really going to follow through? Yeah, you're probably not going to, so better just move the project away or reduce it in its scale so that you make less money and the economy of our community isn't thriving. So these, of course, while trying to solve the local problem, exacerbate the regional problem. There are a lot of communities that are coming up with solutions for this particular problem of traffic impact analysis, including the best ones that are simply changing the significance thresholds and the analysis criteria. So changing what we analyze and we think of as an impact. Reducing the scope of congestion for cars and looking more at is this development project creating a greater place, greater mode choice? Is it making things better for walking and biking in transit? Is it enhancing the person capacity of our transportation network? Other communities are simply excluding infill locations from having to do this pointless traffic analysis at all. And it's actually probably one of the best things that you can do is to say, look, we know that from a regional perspective, it's so much better to develop at infill locations that we're not going to make those infill locations do any traffic impact analysis because it's helping us to solve our regional environmental problems better than anything else that we can do. Other cities are actually looking at, and some have, eliminating intersection level of service as a criteria and instead substituting per capita vehicle miles traveled. And this is a really, really good fix because if your project is generating too high a level of per capita vehicle miles traveled, the solution is never to widen the road or to reduce the density. The solution is to create mode shift, which you can do by increasing density or by implementing transportation demand management measures, which we'll talk about later. There's also the San Francisco approach, which I think I talk about later, so we'll get into that in just a second. Another key factor, number 3, is to levy appropriate transportation impact fees so that projects that have the greatest impact on the transportation network, the ones that are generating the most and the longest vehicle trips, are charged for the infrastructure that's necessary, and that projects that are reducing their vehicle trips, both by location and by transportation demand management, are charged lower fees. Right, and so the San Francisco example, what San Francisco is right now trying to do to get out of this problem is to say, all right, we can estimate what the next 20 years worth of growth is in San Francisco, and now let's step back and do a regional plan that figures out exactly what's the whole array of transportation investments that we need in order to move that many more people. Take the amount of grant funding that we can expect over the next 20 years, subtract that out, figure out what's the project cost that's left, and divide that into the square footage of our new growth over 20 years. Charge every project an impact fee that automatically exempts them from any additional traffic analysis and allows us to build the system that we want. The advantage here is that the result is projects could get approved rather than spending 2 years and a few $100,000 on people like me and lawyers to do traffic impact analyses. The developer writes a check to the city. The plan gets approved the next day, off they go and build something, and the city has money in order to build the transportation infrastructure that it needs. Win, 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 win for all factors concerned. So the San Francisco has the analysis, the Nexus study has been completed. They're moving forward on legislation in order to implement this, and I'm not going to get into the details of that. The next point, we're at point number 4, is fixing our travel demand models. And this is a particularly great place where my industry works really, really hard at obfuscation. There is a reason why we call most of our analytical tools black box tools, because there's a gazillion formulas buried inside this giant, effectively big spreadsheet. And we make sure that people don't understand how it works and how it can be manipulated both for the forces of good as well as for the forces of evil. And so it's important to understand each of the typical steps in a conventional modeling process and how those steps are abused by the forces of evil. And assuming all of you here are among the forces of good, and I would expect that, how you can ask the right questions in order to make sure that the analysis is done better. So 4 steps. Trip generation. And this step that's kind of the easy one. Step 2 is, if your development project has generated a certain number of person trips, what mode of transportation are those people choosing? And here's where the first problem usually arises, where the city is overestimating the vehicle trip generation, or vehicle mode choice, in transit-oriented mixed-use locations. So ask that question, whether they've considered all of the factors that influence mode choice in that step. And then trip distribution, now that we have trips, where are they kind of generally going to? And the 4th step is route assignment, which is, okay, if they're generally going over there, what route are they taking? And then all that gets put into this giant mathematical model that says, here will be the resulting traffic congestion. So it's pretty straightforward and very, very simple, although the results are presented as if they came straight from the mouth of God. So there are many flaws. The flaws, you don't need to understand all of these. In fact, for more information, you can read this book, which will be out, called Sustainable Transportation Planning in 2 weeks. But the biggest are about the way that mode choice is assigned, the assumptions that are made there, as well as the analytical scale, particularly for neighborhoods that have a fine grain of streets. So most typical modeling assigns all the traffic just to the arterials, and so discounts the importance of a fine network of streets. They also tend to ignore an incredibly important factor, which is induced or latent demand. This factor is that what we find when we do the empirical research is that if you widen roadways, people will kind of change their lifestyles and to take advantage of that excess capacity, and you will always fill that capacity. That congestion, in fact, is not the variable, but the constant. That most transportation networks will manage themselves to a fairly constant level of congestion, and that what we do in the transportation industry is not alleviate congestion, but rather move the congestion choke points around, and that the system self-adjusts regardless of how we've moved those choke points around to a constant level of congestion. This is what we find when we do the research in region after region. In fact, when you knock big chunks out of the transportation system, where the model would say people would put up with 6 hours of congestion, in fact, people's travel behavior is very fluid, and you can knock big chunks of your transportation network out, and people will make different decisions about how they get around and what time they travel, and in fact, congestion goes back rather quickly to its usual constant. So it's important that your model adjusts for induced and latent demand, for density, for street network intensity, for the availability of transit, for where it sits in the network relative to primary destinations, and an assortment of other Ds, including good design, as well as transportation demand management. And if your model is not capable of doing these, that's okay. You don't need a very expensive one, but you do need to do what's called post-processing to make adjustments after the fact, as well as to make adjustments feeding into the model to begin with. So the fifth key point is about the demand side of transportation. So one of the things that I have long argued is that one of the root problems in my industry is that it arose largely out of the design of the parkway systems in the 1930s. So transportation street design was largely the province of the field of landscape architecture as late as the 1930s. But soon the design of the Olmstedian overpasses started to become rather complicated. And we needed really skilled civil engineers in order to figure out how to get the design of these facilities right. And their role became increasingly important as the speed of our transportation network, particularly our roadway network, increased. So civil engineering has, since the 1930s, been an essential component of transportation planning, but it's lost sight of the fact that what we are in transportation doing is influencing human behavior, and particularly the human economy. Transportation is better seen as a branch of economics than it is as a branch of civil engineering, although civil engineering is absolutely essential. Because it is tended to be dominated by engineering, it has also tended to be dominated purely by the supply side of economic equations. So in transportation, we deliver facilities, and we get very uncomfortable if we start talking about managing human behavior. Social engineering is they're very dirty terms in our industry. However, that's exactly what every civil engineer in transportation does. They are primarily social engineers. It's merely derogatory if you're trying to change the status quo. So right now, civil engineers in transportation are social engineers, but in defense of the status quo. We need to recognize that a large part of the work that we do is social. It is about human behavior, and therefore we need to think not just about the supply side of the economic equation, but also the demand side. So we know in sustainability that the most sustainable investments are those that make more efficient use out of what we've already got. So retrofitting an old building is always greener than building the most platinum rated, brand new LEED building. The same is true with our transportation network. So investing in things that take advantage of our existing resources are key to sustainability. Next slide. This is one of the ones that doesn't work. So there's a bunch of things that we found. There's an incredibly long list of them, but some of the ones that are most effective include things like universal transit passes. There is some social stigma attached to riding transit. There's a particularly bad social stigma attached to transit when you make it free for everyone. So most of the free transit systems that are out there, except for those that serve very captive specific communities, have failed. However, if you make transit really expensive and then give it away free to free passes to groups of people, whether groups of employers or people at a social service center, their perception of it changes completely, and it actually creates a dopamine reaction in the brain. People get excited about it. This is true. I mean, it's the same as in retail, like putting something like it's the going out of business sale, right? It's the free sample model of service delivery. People get really excited, and you give people something of value, put it in their hand, and they will take transit when they would never have before considered taking transit or having it be useful to them. And so when you take an entire employer or an entire business improvement district or entire homeowners association and give every member a free transit pass, whether they want one or not, they will take it in droves, even in the suburbs. And there's a lot of statistics that I'm not going to go through about how effective some of these programs are. Even in places like Boulder, Colorado, which is one of the most spectacular examples in a low-density environment, where the drive-alone rate, even in a city that has no rail, it's a bus-only city, 36% drive-alone rate, which beats San Francisco. And so cities like Boulder, Colorado, Vancouver, British Columbia, have seen, even as they have grown tremendously, have seen the actual rates of driving drop precipitously because they've made walking and biking and transit a pleasure. We've also seen that price plays a strong role. And even in cities where it's not politically possible to charge for parking, because it's in Leviticus that parking shall be free, if you pay people not to drive, and this is particularly true for employers, they'll behave in the same way. And so employers, many of the Silicon Valley employers like Genentech, pays its employees $5 a day not to drive. That's a major employer that has no access to public transit whatsoever, but has seen its drive-alone rate drop by 15% by simply providing people, by recognizing that providing parking is expensive for them, that they provide free parking to their employees who need to drive, but will pay people $5 a day not to drive because it's cheaper than providing them with parking. Next slide. Other really important factors include in the housing market, not forcing families to buy more or less parking than they need, so separating out the cost of parking from the cost of housing so that a household with 0 cars can afford to buy more housing, and a household with 5 cars can actually have a place to park their cars, also has a significant impact on travel behavior. Next slide. Car sharing programs are tremendously effective, and we're seeing both in this region and in the Pacific Coast, cities that are requiring residential developers to sign all of the households up for a car share membership and putting a car share vehicle in the house or in the complex. What we find is that every car share vehicle that you add, people give up 15 private vehicles and reduce their driving by 50%. Shocking. We have measured this again and again and again in regions all over the country because we can't believe that giving people more access to driving makes them drive less. We predicted the opposite results, and the data is remarkable. Other important programs include Safe Routes to Schools programs. Some of the worst causes of morning peak period congestion are parents chauffeuring their kids around. Programs that help to not only physically make it safer for kids to walk and bike, but particularly provide training programs and programs like walking school buses that organize parents in a given neighborhood to walk through the neighborhood and in a Pied Piper fashion pick up all the kids, bring them to school. Not only is one of the most cost-effective forms of traffic reduction, but is also one of the most cost-effective forms of improving student performance in school. So it's another one of these win-win situations where transportation investments done correctly can achieve larger goals. The next key point, second to last, is pricing. So every good in our society, including the most essential goods of food and clothing and shelter, we use the free market to balance supply and demand and to ensure the adequate production of that good. The only goods in our society that we use the Soviet communist method of allocating are transportation goods. So even my cell phone, when my landline at phone, when I call during business days, it's more expensive than when I call evenings and weekends. We use price in order to balance supply and demand and to ensure that there's adequate availability of every good at all times of day or night whenever we want it. And it's only in transportation where we underprice and therefore create conditions of scarcity. And so another view of congestion is the same as the bread lines in Soviet Russia in the 1970s, when government sets minimum production thresholds for a public good like bread, and then sets maximum price thresholds, in the case of transportation it being 0. The result is both scarcity as well as a decline in quality. And so it's fine to think of transportation as something that's going to be free, but keep in mind that that decision means that it's going to be scarce and is going to require massive government subsidies. And so most people in the transportation industry, including many politicians, have secretly realized that you cannot complain about congestion and say that transportation should be free. The problem is, how do you get there with your constituents? And really the only solution to our transportation congestion problem is to price either roadways, as in the case of toll roads, or cordon pricing, or, as San Francisco is now experimenting with, pricing the trip end in the form of parking fees. It's a whole other story. So the high occupancy toll approach is, yes, in fact, the camel's nose under the tent strategy for introducing the notion of pricing to a very skeptical society that says, well, where will the poor people drive if we turn our roadways into so-called Lexus lanes? Well, in fact, when we go and survey the poor people, they are, in fact, far more interested in roadway pricing as a social equity means because, one, we can take the money that's raised and invest it in things that disproportionately benefit people who are low income, but also, amazingly, low income people actually care about their time, particularly single mothers, who are more time pressured than almost any other sector of our society. And so the camel's nose under the tent strategy is pursuing, but really the communities that have figured out how to deal with traffic congestion are the ones that have really gone full forward on pricing, particularly cities like Stockholm, which I think is in many ways more successful in London than London in implementing congestion pricing in order to eliminate congestion throughout the city and to create a sustainable funding source to expand the person capacity of their transportation network dramatically without having to raise additional tax dollars. So in most ways, it's made the vast majority of travelers in Stockholm happier because the people who need to drive can now drive reliably. And the people who are interested in a choice other than driving now have a better funded choice. It is also important to remember that even in the most congested situation, all we need to do is to create 10% mode shift in order for traffic to be free-flowing again. So another thing that people misunderstand is that, you want everyone to ride their bike. Well, I'm not going to ride my bike, or you want everyone to take the bus. No, sir, we don't need you to ride your bike or take the bus. It's fine for you to drive. Can I just have a raise of hands of, are there a few people in this room that might be interested in every now and then taking the bus or walking and biking if we were able to make those choices better? And in any situation, yeah, so we have one here. Do we have a couple more? All right, there we go. So that, done. All right, so my last point, which is my favorite and is the one that is easiest and that every community has no excuse but to do, is to get smarter about managing their parking. Parking is incredibly expensive to provide. It is like airlines who would buy separate airplanes for every single flight that they want to make, or keep a reserve of airplanes in their fleet just in case somebody might need them. It is an incredibly valuable capital resource, and it also consumes an enormous amount of land. And so one of the things that we do to make fun of our clients is to convert their minimum parking requirements from spaces per 1,000 square feet to 1,000 square feet of parking per 1,000 square feet of land area, to show them that the building is a small percentage, the space for humans is a small percentage of the space for cars. Parking spaces are also really expensive to provide. And while, as a motorist, you may be thrilled to see an empty parking space, like nothing more welcoming than a big empty parking space in front of you, as an economist or as a developer, every empty parking space is at least $20,000, and in many cases $40,000 or $60,000. That's just going wasted. Money that could be spent on far more interesting community benefits. There's also a powerful relationship between the way we deal with parking and housing affordability. Every parking space you add to a residential unit typically increases the price of the unit by about 15 to 30% and decreases the number of units that you can build in a typical parcel by about 15 to 25%. And a parking space, when you count its share of the drive aisles, takes up about the same amount of square footage as a studio apartment. And so when we fly over America, and again, who knows where this is? It could be, this is California. We see the result of our approach to parking with minimum parking requirements for each separate land use. And again, mix of uses, we've got work, we've got some shopping, here's some residential, there's a hotel. But if you were to want to go to lunch from this office building to this restaurant over here, you're going to get in your car. And so in this country, in a Soviet communist manner, we have set minimum production thresholds that assume, that require a minimum of 8 housing units for every single motor vehicle that's out there, motor vehicles that sit idle 99% of the time. So 8 housing units for every car, but not enough housing units for every human. And so we also complain then about when we can't find a space, that we need to build more parking rather than manage the parking that we got, not realizing that in most retail commercial districts that have badly managed parking, that up to 30% of the traffic is people driving around in circles trying to find an empty parking space. When, again, if we could just get some of those people to parking spaces more quickly, we could eliminate congestion in commercial districts. All right, so that's my diatribe. What are the solutions? Solution number 1 is invest in smart technology. The price of technology has come way down in order to get motorists information about the parking that they need, and most importantly, when they go and they pay for parking, to make sure that they can pay for parking with tools that they have readily available in their wallets. I am not carrying around with me $16 worth of quarters. Coin-operated meters should be made illegal. And all meters should, and in fact the district is doing a good job with this, take credit cards, debit cards, and payment by cell phone. So once you've got decent technology, then you can set the right price. And the right price for parking is very, very simple. As those of you who've read Don Shoup know, I'm hoping by verbatim now, the right price for parking is the lowest price at which about 15% of parking spaces will be available at any given time on any given block face or parking lot or parking garage. Okay, so once again, the right price for parking, you can all say it with me, is the lowest price at which about 15% of spaces are available at all times of day. That's the right price for parking, because what other price could possibly be better? If you increase the price of parking, you have too many empty spaces, you're wasting that resource. If you decrease the price of parking, you have all your spaces are full and people can't find a space and they're driving around in circles. So what that means is that the price of parking needs to vary by location, including one block may be more expensive than the next. On-street parking needs to be a lot more expensive than off-street parking in a garage, because people really want the Marilyn Monroe space out front, don't want to park in the garage. And so you need to adjust your parking accordingly. You also then need to adjust the times which you charge for parking. So if your parking demand is exactly the same on a Sunday as it is on a Saturday, no matter what it says in Leviticus, you should be charging for parking on Sunday as well if you want customers to be able to find a space. And if you're in a retail and entertainment destination, you should be charging for parking on Friday and Saturday nights, not till 5, but as in Pasadena, California, until midnight on Friday and Saturday, because that's when their peak parking demand is, because they're a restaurant district. Another thing to think about is where your parking revenue goes. And if politically you need to invest it in the district that it is raised in, you can bond against your parking revenue and do significant improvements. Or you can take your parking revenue, put it into your transportation fund, but make sure that you're investing that in things that people really care about, and that you can report back to your community that you're taking the parking money, not just because you're evil, money-grubbing government, but you're taking it in order to do things that people care about. Once you've done these things, then government does not need to interfere in the development market to set minimum production thresholds for parking. The private development market is going to be much more skilled at figuring out what the optimal number of parking spaces are for any given development project according to the market. You really don't need minimum parking requirements anywhere in any city. And many cities across the country are simply eliminating minimum parking requirements, which does not mean that developers are not building parking. They're building a lot of parking, but they're being smarter about the number of spaces to build, and they're being given incentives to manage that parking well, because it's now part of the market economy rather than the Soviet communist method of doing things. And in fact, in the United Kingdom, minimum parking requirements are illegal as a matter of national law because they only produce socially pernicious results. Finally, you need to pull all of these policies together and to manage parking on a district basis. So right now, if you've got a strip commercial, so that's your like strip highway, which we saw earlier, and you have different land uses along that strip commercial, and you have minimum parking requirements for each land use, and they're separate, and you'll notice the parking area is bigger than the building because that's what the requirements are. If you think about a typical trip where dad's driving Sally to school and he has to drop her off, and that requires a parking space, and then he drives back on the arterial and he goes to work, and that requires a parking space. And then he has to go pick Sally up from school and take her to soccer practice because she can't walk herself across the horrible arterial. And then he has to go and he has to pick up groceries, do some shopping, and that's another parking space. And he goes back and he picks Sally up and he goes home. And that's a lot of parking spaces. It's also a lot of turning movements on the arterial, which are creating a disproportionate amount of congestion. If instead you take that same arterial and you create an interconnected grid of streets, and you focus your development in a street and sidewalk-oriented pattern, and you allow them to share parking, notice the parking area is cut by more than half. And this is typical. Typically, we see, even in very, very heavily retail and restaurant districts, parking demand, peak cumulative parking demand between 1.2 and 2.0 spaces per 1,000 square foot, even in places that require 14 spaces per 1,000. Then we have the same trip, right? So dad drives, he parks, Sally walks herself to school, he goes to work, Sally can now walk herself to soccer practice, and dad can pick up stuff on his way home from work. They meet at the car, and off they go. So same exact trip, this is not transit, but dramatically different traffic results. Half the parking area, half the land area, a quarter of the arterial trips, and about an eighth of the arterial vehicle miles traveled. So huge impact on economic performance, on traffic congestion, and on social capital, simply by rethinking the way we orient development and manage parking as if it were a valuable resource. There's a lot more that I can ramble on about. You can see more information in my book, which is available in 2 weeks, and I'd be happy to take questions.